The body of former Pope Benedict XVI will lie in state from today in St. Peter's Basilica and will be presided over by Pope Francis. The former Pope Benedict died on Saturday at the age of 95 in the Mater Ecclesiae Monastery in the Vatican. He was elected Pope on the 19th of April 2005 and succeeded Pope John Paul II. To help unpack the former Pope's legacy, we're now joined via Zoom by the editor of the Southern Africa's Catholic monthly magazine, The Southern Cross, Gunther Simmermacher. Gunther, a very good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good morning, Sir Peter. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you so much for joining us, and a Happy New Year to you. First of all,
Happy New Year to the viewers.
Indeed. First of all, take us back to when former Pope Benedict's appointment. What was happening at the time?
Well, as you said, he was succeeding Pope John Paul II, and before that he had been his doctrinal official, the leader or the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And as such, he had a particular reputation. He was called the Panzer Cardinal, a reference to his German background, which made him seem like a bit of an enforcer, a bit of a hard man. And many people thought that what they would get as a new pope would be that hard man, that doctrinal enforcer. And well, it turned out, of course, that he wasn't quite that character that people thought that he was going to be. He was not going to be the Panzer Cardinal, but he was inheriting a church that had been led by the same pope for a very long time, for more than 2 decades. So he certainly had to fill very, very big shoes, which Pope John Paul II had left behind.
So what were some of the major issues that he faced with while at the helm?
Well, the big issue, of course, was something that had broken about 4 years before he became Pope, and that was a sexual abuse scandal in the church. It was a very difficult situation at a time when many people in the Vatican were still struggling to make sense of all this, and there was some resistance as well within the church, within the Vatican, to handling the abuse scandal in the proper way. So that was the big issue that Pope Benedict was facing, and he handled some of the things very, very quickly. He was the first pope to try to get a handle on the sexual abuse scandal. He was the first pope to meet with victims of sexual abuse within the church by church personnel, and he was the first pope to really take action against some priests. Now, this is not to say that the actions that he took were flawless. They were not flawless. And there was still a lot of work to be done. Arguably, the response still is not flawless. But he made a start, and that, I think, is something that is important to remember, that he was somebody who was trying to recognize that there was a huge problem, even if it was small steps in the beginning.
And at some point, Benedict himself acknowledged that he was a weak administrator, saying that he showed a lack of resolve in governing and decision-taking. So what was he essentially admitting to?
Well, yes, he was a poor administrator. Sometimes he was a very poor judge of character. Some of the appointments that he made were not good appointments of bishops and even of people within the Vatican. I think that his appointment of Cardinal Bertone as the Secretary of State, which is sort of the Prime Minister of the Vatican, is not something that is uncontroversial. He was not a very good administrator. He was not a very good judge of character, but he was a fantastic theologian. And I think that is the legacy that we should concentrate on, that he was somebody who defined how we should relate our lives to the spiritual demands of our faith. And he did so in a way that was learned, and it was also quite gentle. Of course, he had his doctrinal issues as well, and sometimes he exercised those doctrinal issues with greater sensitivity, and sometimes with not great sensitivity. But I think that is the area where we should focus his legacy, rather than the administration, where things were not going quite as well as they might have. But that is, of course, the problem with the papacy in general, that there will always be weak spots. It's a very difficult job to be a pope, of course. You have to have all kinds of talents and all kinds of capacities and capabilities, very much like being a bishop as well. So to judge a pontificate is a very difficult thing to do, because you are going to find light and you're going to find shade.
You know, Gunther, what I know is that not so many people know that during World War II, he was actually required to join Hitler Youth, which is a wing of the Nazi party, and he was later drafted into, the anti-aircraft unit and then the infantry of the Nazi Germany. And in 1945, he deserted the German military and was held as a prisoner of war by the Americans. So what do we know about this aspect of his life?
Well, we do know that the Ratzinger family, who were living in Bavaria near the Austrian border, were fiercely anti-Nazi. Many Catholics in the Third Reich were actually anti-Nazi because the Nazi regime did persecute the Catholic Church. So there was a lot of I would say passive resistance to the Nazis among many Catholics, and the Ratzinger family was a family that was anti-Nazi. They did not go on the barricades because, well, if you went on the barricades to protest against the Nazi regime, you probably would not survive that action. But as you said, we know that he joined the Hitler Youth because in 1936 it became law that all boys in Germany had to join the Hitler Youth. So it was not a matter of choice. We know that the young Josef Ratzinger was 9 years old when he was drafted into the Hitler Youth, so to speak. We know that he didn't attend meetings. He signed up but never went, and got away with it apparently, which also shows what sort of community he was living in. Well, of course, German man did not have a choice about being drafted into the army. It was his conscription, and if you refused to go, well, you would not survive that decision either, unless you went into some sort of hiding. And as you also note, the young Josef Ratzinger went AWOL. He defected and sort of handed himself over to American forces and was held prisoner of war, from which he was very quickly released as well.
Right, right. And Russian President Vladimir Putin on Saturday hailed the late Pope Benedict as a defender of traditional Christian values. So what did the former Pope mainly stand for?
Well, he stood for so many things that we would have to define exactly what do we mean he was standing for. I mean, he was standing for traditional teachings of the Church. Some of them, of course, in secular society, especially very, very controversial. His stance on homosexuality, on abortion, on sexual morality were conservative. And he certainly had very strong views on those. At the same time, he was also, the Pope Benedict was also a strong advocate of what is known as Catholic social justice, which is very critical of capitalism and believes in the protection of workers and people on the periphery of the economy. That is something, of course, that Pope Francis has continued very strongly as well. Pope Benedict was very strong on the ecology. Maybe that is something that President Putin has forgotten about, but there's a very strong thread throughout the papacy of Pope Benedict that stressed our responsibility to maintain creation. And again, that is something that Pope Francis has continued with very strongly as well. And then, as I said, there was the theological side of Pope Benedict as well, which again, I do not know how much Vladimir Putin knows about that or appreciates it, but for Pope Benedict, it was always Christ at the center of everything.
Right. Remember in 2006, if I'm not mistaken, he conducted a lecture in Regensburg, and he seemed to criticize the Islamic view of God and the legacy of Prophet Muhammad. That particular lecture led to protests in the Middle East and South Asia. So let's now talk about, that particular view, that Islamic view of God. What is it today?
Well, I cannot speak for Islam, of course, but I can comment on what Pope Benedict was trying to do on that particular day. And well, he was overestimating, I think, the extent to which he would be properly understood. He is an academic, and therefore he was quoting something in an academic way rather than this quote reflecting what he was personally believing. But it was a injudicious choice of quote, and the backlash, I think, taught him a lot of lessons as well. And I think it motivated him as well to conduct his interfaith relations in a more concentrated way. So he was very strong on dialogue with Islam. He was very strong on dialogue with Judaism, and also on dialogue with other faiths. So when it comes to Islam, he went to Turkey, and he went into the Blue Mosque and prayed there with Muslim leaders. So he was not anti-Islamic or anything like that. He certainly was interested in having that dialogue, and that unfortunate quote, I think, was a misguided attempt at kickstarting such a dialogue. But it was a very unfortunate incident, and he learned from that, I think.
Right. So what, in your opinion, has changed at the Vatican in the nearly 10 years since he stepped down?
The tone has changed a lot, of course. Pope Francis is a pastoral pope, and I think that is a big difference between Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. I think doctrinally they are not very far apart from one another, but where Pope Benedict's pastoral application of the teachings of the Church was cautious, conservative, and not necessarily inclusive, Pope Francis has thrown open the doors. Pope Francis sees the Church as a field hospital for the wounded, a place where sinners have to be invited into rather than being barred from entry, and where virtue is not the necessary passport to joining the Catholic Church. That, I think, is one of the major changes, and of course, that pastoral approach of Pope Francis has caused some division in the Church as well, to such an extent that there are some people who reject some Catholics, some very right-wing Catholics, who are rejecting the pontificate of Pope Francis and sort of still hanker for previous pontificates, including that of Pope Benedict.
Yeah, and speaking of Pope Francis, who's also facing his own health issues, and there's also reports that he had been contemplating stepping down, but he was reluctant to do so if it meant that there would be 3 popes in Rome. Does this change anything?
I think what we are going to expect is that Pope Francis is going to set up some rules that's going to govern the existence of popes emeritus. With Pope Francis, of course, succeeding the first pope to have resigned in 600 years, well, it was a new place for everybody, and nobody really knew how to handle such a situation, and there was no plan in place on what to do with an ex-pope, with a retired pope. I do not know what Pope Francis is going to do. It would not surprise me if he is going to set up some sort of rule whereby a retired pope would revert to the rank of cardinal and maybe not live in the Vatican or be free to live somewhere else. It wouldn't surprise me if Pope Francis is looking at retirement himself in a few years' time. At the moment, his health is still very good, except for his bad knee. But for a man of 86 years, he is still in very good shape otherwise. So there might still be a few years of Pope Francis yet. But if he should come to a point where he believes that he cannot govern the Church effectively, I'm pretty sure that he would exercise the option of resignation, of abdicating the responsibility of the papacy. And by then, some sort of plan has to be in place. And as you say, it is probably not a good idea to have multiple popes in the Vatican because there's always the risk of there being two centers of power. And I'm not saying that that is what happened with Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict handled the whole thing by and large very responsibly and sensitively, but there is always the danger that people are going to refer to a still living pope and choose to disregard the reigning pope, something that Pope Benedict, of course, would have been aghast to know.
And it's often said that his pontificate will inevitably be linked to so many controversies. And as for his own personal legacy, I suppose it'll be likely defined by one issue that concerned him the most, which is how the Catholic Church can still make a difference in the modern world. So what do you think then is his greatest legacy, and how do you think the world would remember him?
We're talking about Pope Benedict.
Pope Benedict, yes.
Yes, his legacy, I think, is going to be remembered mostly within the Catholic Church, I think, as a great theologian, as a great spiritual writer. He wrote some wonderful spiritual books, a series of the life of Jesus, which is so accessible. The encyclicals are going to be referred to for many, many years. So I think that in years to come within the Catholic Church, he's going to be remembered as a great spiritual writer, as a great theologian, as somebody that can be referred back to when we are trying to define what it means to be a Christian. And I think he's going to be remembered in the longer term as well, not just a Catholic theologian, but also as a giant in Christian writing. I think that his writings have got application well outside the Catholic Church for Christians as well. And even, I think, people who are not believers might find some sort of philosophical value in the writings of Pope Benedict or Joseph Ratzinger. So I think that's where we find the legacy of Pope Benedict, rather than in any kind of temporal or secular arena.
And I suppose then we cannot divorce the issue of the relationship between Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. Remember that he gave interviews upon his resignations and put his name on writing that seemed to criticize the reforms of Pope Francis, who succeeded him. How then would we, analyze the relationship between the two popes?
I think the relationship was very good indeed. We must not forget that Pope Benedict was a theologian and academic, and therefore when he was writing, or when he was lending his name to writings or associated himself with writings, he was doing it from an academic point of view, rather than to put himself up in opposition to Pope Francis. Pope Francis has said that Pope Benedict was always very loyal to him, very supportive of him. Pope Francis saw him as some sort of spiritual uncle, and went often to him for advice as well. And the relationship between the two of them was very warm. I think that sometimes Pope Benedict's name was misused or not wisely used. I think sometimes he was not very well advised when he lent his name to certain writings and certain books. But most of the things that he has written himself, I do not think that anybody can say that he set himself up in opposition to Pope Francis.
Okay. All right. Gunther, great chatting to you. A lovely conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. That was editor of the Southern African's Catholic monthly magazine, The Southern Cross, Gunther Simmermacher, helping us zoom into the legacy of former Pope Benedict XVI, who died on Saturday at the age of 95.